us newbies.
Thank you for having me back this evening. We started this a few weeks ago, and I want to make sure that we answer all your questions that are needed. I've been asked to review the municipality's policy or procedure regarding bullying in the workplace. One thing that I will say is that bullying is not just for the grade schools and the high schools, but the colleges and universities and high schools are all under Title IX, which there is a specific requirement for a bullying type policy. What we did was I went around and I got a clicker, and I'm not supposed to be using it, but I'm going to try. Oh. Okay. The overview is really to talk about bullying and to go through bullying and harassment, look at local policies, the Rock Island policy and policy issues, and in passing talk about some other ordinances that we've seen around the country. One thing that I think is really clear is that bullying has been defined as an unwelcome behavior that occurs over a period of time and is meant to harm someone who feels powerless to respond. The behavior unreasonably interferes with the employee regardless of motivation. Typically in municipalities, in their ordinances and in their policies, you generally see a use of the words interchangeably as part of a definition. You don't see standalone policies or procedures. And that is, the reason for that is that when you have a handbook or a policy or procedure manual, you want to invite, you don't want to limit. And so by inviting, by putting those terms in without any limitors, you're able to gather more. So your policies and procedures are going to be broader than what the law is. And in fact, yours is broader than what the law is. Locally, though, I went through and we looked at Bettendorf, Davenport, East Moline, and Rock Island County, and not one of them has a standalone bullying policy. Rock Island County and Davenport have used the words interchangeably regarding harassment and bullying together, similar to kind of what our policy does without mentioning bullying, but should and could be amended to have that. So went through and show you that Bettendorf does not mention bullying, discusses and defines offensive behavior, prohibits offensive and hostile work or conduct, unwelcome sexual advances, discrimination against members of a protected class, and retaliation against a person who files a complaint. Davenport frequently mentions bullying, prohibits harassment and bullying, and only uses the word bullying with harassment, never on its own. It provides examples of harassment and bullying and offers extensive advice as what to do if the employee observes or experiences harassment. East Moline, again, follows the similar line as Bettendorf, as does Moline. Rock Island, our city, does not mention bullying, but discusses and provides examples of harassing behavior, and states policy applies to all employees and non-employees and presides for procedures for filing a complaint. In fact, when you look at our harassment policy, the harassment policy is on the left-hand side. It is not limiting the protection to members of a protected class, instead granting protection to all employees of the city of Rock Island. It already prohibits bullying without necessarily using those words. But if you want, and what I've been able to do is I've taken and I've actually added language to the current policy for your review at a later date. I do have copies of that for you to see if you'd like, where I've inputted and basically used the terms harassment and bullying in tandem so that it's more expansive and it's more readily available. I also have put in the policy that I've done a clause where we will all wish that somebody could come up and say, hey, this is offensive or this is bothering me. And we've put that in writing so that we can do it, because a lot of times what happens is people don't realize, they don't understand, they don't get the complexities of the relationship that they're in. So what I tried to do is say, listen, if you can, not a requirement, but if you can go ahead and tell the individual that you find it offensive. And then I made sure that they strengthened the statement prohibiting her retaliation. When I looked at trying to kind of come up with municipalities that have covered bullying on their own, you have to go far and wide to find anything. You have something in Anchorage, you have a county in Maryland, you have District of Columbia, Massachusetts, there's some in Wisconsin, but they're all focused on youth bullying. And they're actually bullying with ordinances with violations giving a monetary amount against the parents of the people that are bullying. So they go much more expansive, but very few, and the reason is, again, we don't want to limit people to come through or come forward with complaints. What we want to do is handle them with respect, and we want to take them through the system with respect so that we can alleviate the problem and necessity for them to go out and find a lawyer or go try to fight it through litigation. That's our goal. And we are an inviting group, and that's what we did, and that's what I've done with the policies.
Matt, can I interrupt you real quickly?
Yep.
So have you looked at, when were the dates of, I mean, obviously you don't know all of them, but on the comparisons or the other cities or, you know, policies that you looked at, I mean, how old were those policies? Because bullying as a term has kind of become more relevant in the last few years, and obviously if those things were written several years ago, then I can understand.
Actually, the reason that they don't, and the reason, the thinking behind it is that you don't want to limit. You're limiting yourself by a bullying policy, and then you're watering down what you're trying to prevent, which is the protected status discrimination.
No, I'm not talking about why it was not mentioned in those policies. I guess that was my question.
Year-wise, I can't tell you that, but some of them are very recent.
Because there is a distinct entity between harassment and bullying. I mean, so maybe in the policy you could maybe define those two terms in the policy?
And in fact, I think that they have been.
Okay.
And I think, and I could even put more for a definitional term, but also by defining what bullying is, also limits you. Because bullying is a concept that is not really something that's going to be understood. You may think bullying is one thing, I might think it's another. And we have to look at it objective and subjectively to determine whether or not it in fact rises to the level of violation of the policy. My biggest concern, Randy, is what Alderman Hurt, I'm sorry. My biggest concern is diluting the protected status discrimination and harassment by enveloping a separate, distinct claim for bullying. Bullying is just, again, it's a very difficult subject to define.
Well, if you look at the definition of bullying, it's like to coerce or strong arm or to intimidate. And harassment doesn't necessarily fall under the strong arm category, at least in my opinion. I think harassment, I mean, you could harass somebody, but bullying typically is basically trying to get your way by whatever tactics you're using. So to me, in my mind, they're two separate, distinct things. So I guess maybe a definition of the two anyway. I mean, you can combine them however you want, but I think but in my opinion, there still is a definitive, again, in my mind, there's a definitive difference between the two terms.
See, everybody really, when they look at harassment, they look at it, harassment being based on sex or sexual harassment in the Me Too. That's not what it's limited to. It's way beyond that.
Correct.
And it should be, and it needs to encompass everything. And that's kind of what we've done. But I agree with you.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Okay, if you're done, then I do have
You had
one.
another slide, didn't you?
Yep. The conclusion.
No, there's one other one. That one.
Solutions, I'm sorry. The solution was to add language to include bullying, just as you've requested, prohibit the retaliation, elaborate on the investigation and reporting procedures. The key in all of this, though, is training, is making sure that your staff and your employees understand what it is to bully, just as we're having this debate, and what it is to be a violation of the policy. And that's something that's easily effectuated. In fact, I've done this for many corporations and companies and political subdivisions, and have done that as well. But it's very important because one of the things without training, everybody's going to have their own perception as to what it is not.
So the training is just going to be harassment? What kind of training is it?
The training would be it would envelop both harassment, bullying, everything.
Who's going to do it?
That's not, I've offered to do
Oh,
it. I've offered to do it, and I've done it, and I do it for a lot of corporations, a lot of entities, and I feel very comfortable doing it. And it's absolutely imperative that it's done appropriately, because you have to go through the definitional terms, make sure that they understand what it is, and no matter what we do in those trainings, you'll have an uptick in people claiming harassment or bullying. The reason is it's just the nature. It's the nature of humans to basically go, oh, wait a minute. And they didn't hear what the definitional terms might be.
Okay. The only reason I ask is because there is a big difference between harassment and bullying. Bullying is often intentional, and it's often done by a strong-willed person against a weaker person. And so I'm glad that you put harassment and bullying together. If this is the new policy that was attached?
This is
or-
actually,
No, there's
this
more
is the
to
new
it.
policy. And that's different. The one that I think that was attached is not right.
Okay.
This one, and I can have these handed out if you want.
So we haven't done any kind of harassment or bullying training, at least in anyone's memory. So this will be a mandatory training for everybody, for all employees?
Okay.
Yellow is,
And we don't have set up yet who's going to give the training. That would be something we'd decide. It would be out, it would not be an in-house person.
Okay.
But-
I would also like to suggest, the training on harassment and bullying is very important. But I also think management training is important too, because there are sometimes that people feel as a manager, it's because I tell you to do it, you have to do it,
Right.
and that's not necessarily management. And I think sometimes people get promoted into positions and really have no idea how to manage people.
I agree with you.
Okay. Okay.
Is there any changes? I see you got up there prohibit retaliation. Is, just glancing at that,
It's there at the end.
is it? Okay, that's fine. As long as it's in there.
The
that's fine.
the one thing that I think is really very important, and I hate to go back to a book, but Michael Crichton did a book on disclosure, and one of the quotes from that book was, harassment is not about sex or about age or race or anything. It's about power. It's about unequal bargaining power.
Right.
And that's what needs to stop. And it needs to be that you should be judged on your own merit. If you'd like to read the Department of Education's tome, I don't know.
I don't have that kind of time.
That's what I have for you. Is there any other
Okay.
questions?
All right, walk me through, because I wasn't here, what is our current, what's the current process for employee A feels like they're being bullied by employee B? What does employee A do?
Generally, what they need to do is report to a supervisor. What initially, and what I've added, I actually added another line there, but they need to report to the supervisor. The supervisor then needs to turn it over to HR or to the city manager so it can be investigated. And it can be investigated either internally or externally.
And if the bullying is being performed by a supervisor, do they just go straight to HR and/or Randy?
That's correct.
Okay, now what does HR do with the complaint? What's the process?
Do you want to go ahead, Jeff?
I can speak to that. Typically, when there's a complaint filed with the HR department here, then we set up a pre-dis notice with the employee. Usually before that's done, a statement's taken from the complaining person here to find out exactly what the issues are, so those all get kind of spelled out, maybe request some type of written statement. So I have, sometimes I've had people back out of these things here. So that kind of, at least, if they're going to make the complaint, it has to move forward here. And so after that's done, then we have the pre-dis meeting Basically, an investigation is performed. If other people need to be brought in and investigated, they're brought into the meeting here too. The employee is reminded that's being investigated, that no retaliatory action will be taken, otherwise it will result in termination of their employment. And I guess at that point, then I look at all the facts, I write a report, present it to the city manager here, and if necessary, discipline meted out.
And if there are requirements that the employees have to follow and they choose not to, and they violate those, what happens then?
You'd be
Like if
disciplined.
there's action steps and it's like, you will not do this and you will not do that, and
They can be and should
they
be
continue to
disciplined.
do it?
They can be and should be disciplined.
But on average, I mean, HR department will be about 1 to 3 of these complaints a year. And
Yeah.
they're a big deal. Follow through on them,
So at these pre-dis meetings, I don't know what that is. Is it the complainer and the complainee?
Predis is a term that's used more in the union setting, but it's more of a, it's giving, it's a right for an individual to, pre-disciplinary, that's what it is. That's pre-disciplinary.
So that's only with the person who's being accused?
Right.
Do you have meetings where the accuser and the accusee come together and hash things out?
We have been able to give that as an ability for somebody to use, like a mediation, and that sometimes is to let the steam off, to try to develop and go through it, is a wonderful way, and that's something we've worked through within the policies and procedures.
Okay, I mean, that seems bizarre to me.
It's
If-
totally bizarre.
If I filed a complaint against,
To want to do that, to
No,
mediate?
to put the harasser in the
Oh,
room
no, no,
with
no, that
the
doesn't happen.
victim,
That
and
do-
allow them to continually to attack without anyone stopping it.
What I guess, and I apologize if I made a misstatement, but what we're trying to do is if it is something that is wanted or desired by either side, we try to ask the other side whether or not they wish to mediate it, and then we try to have a mediator come in and mediate. It's not something that's done lockstep. There is no lockstep. You can't script these.
No,
And you
I
can't,
know.
and you can't script the process and procedure in which to go to get a resolution. Some may fall into that mediation. Some might go, I don't understand. I didn't understand. I'm sorry. That could be all that it takes. Others may need discipline.
all right, but it's not standard operating procedure to have the complainer and the accused sit down together and, like, try to,
And not only that, if it is, it's to mediate, and it's trying to resolve, and it's done with a professional mediator or somebody that has experience doing that. It's not something that would be done as a,
do we contract out with a mediator, or is it John?
I've done them before here too, but usually we're dealing with conflict resolution issues. Maybe it's just people aren't communicating, they're squabbling over things here, and things aren't getting done, and there's questions about who should be doing what. I mean, those are, I think, kind of ripe opportunities to use something like conflict resolution, where you kind of spell out what the issues are, try to work through them and get resolved to them here. Versus someone coming in and saying, well, this person's harassed me or did these things to me, then they're not ever put into the same room.
I guess I'm only talking about bullying. I should clarify that then. Yeah, if it's a harassment claim, but for bullying, if somebody's complaining that an employee is bullying them, do you have them sit down together and say, what's the problem? That, I mean, even, an accusation of harassment or bullying, it just seems like it would make the person accusing the other person of bullying very uncomfortable to have to sit in a meeting with the person who's allegedly bullying them. I mean, that just seems odd.
but it is an alternative.
It is an alternative.
if it is something that has been accepted.
Do we have written policies as to how the personnel director handles the complaint?
Yeah, it's kind of spelled out into the procedure here. I do the investigation, submit a report to the city manager
Well-
for review, and then there's a decision made on whether discipline is needed out.
And the city manager is the person who ultimately has that authority?
I make the recommendation here, but obviously the city manager has to agree with my recommendation.
In any other employment situation, can a department director decide on disciplinary action, or is it strictly always just the city manager that does disciplinary decisions for the city?
On your recommendation.
Well, yeah, it would be based on my recommendation or possibly the supervisor of the department head's direction, but it's ultimately the city manager that makes the determination whether someone's going to terminate or not.
Okay.
So, I mean, department managers do discipline all the time.
Right. That's what I'm trying to understand.
All the time. So it depends if, whatever the issue is, if it rises to the level of HR or not.
What do we do if, there are certain employees that you work with regularly, department heads, et cetera. You have established relationships, not relationships, but, you work with these people all the time. Well, I guess that wouldn't make any sense. So I was going to ask, what happens in the case of bias from your perspective? If somebody complains about a department director that you work well with and you like their work, is there a concern of bias on your decision as to whether to enact any sort of discipline? But I guess if that's the case, then it questions your ability to do any sort of assessment to the employee's performance, like a regular annual performance evaluation. So I don't know. I'm just trying to spitball here, thinking of stuff.
I mean, to me, it's a big deal. It's a huge deal. I feel we need a zero tolerance policy. I realize that's not always realistic. But I guess, my concern is I don't think it really matters how long an employee's been here. I don't think it matters what their title or their job is here. I think if they are harassing and bullying somebody, they need to be disciplined and given action steps. And if they violate those action steps, I don't care who they are, they need to go.
Right.
And I think that that's something that needs to be embraced because because as a city, it costs us money because you have an employee who comes to work, who is bullied and harassed. They're not functioning well, they're not feeling well. It impacts their work, which in turn, we're paying for them to be working here. If they're not comfortable here because they're being harassed and the city's choosing to stick their head in the sand and look a different way, then all of a sudden you have an employee who is not performing efficiently. And it also costs the city because your medical bills go up because that person is going to the doctor for physical complaints as a result of the bullying. So I think by not addressing it firmly and pretending that it's going to get better or it's going to go away, I think in the long run, it costs us money. And so that's one of the reasons why I really feel that this needs to be taken seriously and dealt with appropriately.
And I agree with everything you said, but I also think within the confines of the policies and procedures that I've seen, I think yours does that. Now, implementation may be something that's, as to how it's implemented, may be another issue.
Okay.
But I'm going to tell you from a standpoint of how broad your policy can be interpreted, it does those things that you've required.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I would say that the concern is more so implementation
Yeah.
of the policy. And that's where I was asking if we had written policies as to, I understand that we have a policy that says the personnel director shall investigate and submit to the city manager a report, but what is the procedure by which you go about investigating? That's what
Right.
I want to know,
Right.
How do you do that?
Right.
That's my question. Not necessarily do we have a bullying policy, but how do we go about making sure that this is a fair or transparent or whatever process?
And how we start that is from the top down and then from the bottom up. And I mean that by basically training
Yeah.
and adopting and having this discussion. And I think this has been wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. So as I'm reading the very end of this, it talks about the full range of disciplinary action. What are the disciplinary steps that take place should a complaint be filed? I mean, by reading what's written here, it could be a slap on the wrist or it could be a complete discharge. Is there like
It could be.
there's set penalty? I mean, who is there set penalties or?
There shouldn't be, and it's just, well, I don't want to script the result, and that would be really problematic for me, because if, let's say that I came in and I made one comment, and I didn't know that it bothered the mayor. And then I am apologetic, I didn't know it, but your policy says 0 tolerance,
Okay.
or that I need to be terminated. That's not fair either. So I don't believe in scripting. I think that you have to have the business judgment and make sure that you're and that's why I put, if you notice the language, the good faith language, the reasonableness, those types of terms in there so that it can allow you to make those decisions, but not predisposed to a certain decision or outcome. There are many cases, in the 30 years that I've been doing this, there are many cases that I've found valid claims, and there are other claims that I've found that have been made up.
Okay.
And what we do is we actually err on the side of discipline than anything else.
What type of liabilities are cities open to for employees that have been bullied?
Attorney's fees,
Yeah, well, I
the
mean,
damages, you name it. I mean, it can be rather large, significant.
right,
Correct. Anything else?
Sorry, Emily, any issues of compliance to a bullying harassment policy? Like, do we have, for trainings, is there a way to follow up? Remember,
Yes.
I talked to you about, what was the, here at Heartland Compliance, he was retired from John Deere. He did kind of compliance on diversity training, but are there things out there for?
Yes.
Is that part of your recommendation
Yes.
too?
It's part of the training is robust.
And then there's a compliance. that
Compliance
loops
piece
to
that
it.
loops to come back.
do we have a total number of complaints of bullying that have been filed by employees in the last 3 years or whatever? Do we track that?
Yeah, I can pull that information up. I have all the reports, I mean, I can pull it up, but like I said, it's probably an average about 1 to 3 a year.
And do we have, how many of them resulted in disciplinary action?
I'd have to look that up, but some of them do. I mean, there was discipline given out earlier this year for.
I think we need to kind of talk in generalities, I'm sorry. if I
It's
can.
personnel issues, and I'm
Personnel
not sure it's
issues.
the
I'm not
council's-
asking who, I'm asking
I'm
if
not-
we've had 100 complaints
I'm not-
filed and
I'm not
0
suggesting-
resulted in discipline, I would suspect that the process by which my
not s-
staff does this is not working.
I'm not suggesting that at all, by any means. What I'm suggesting is that these are things that are probably taken for closed session issues.
Well, can we request an executive session on this subject matter for the next council meeting, please?
We could do it tonight.
Can we, I mean, we can't do it tonight because it's not posted on the agenda.
That's correct.
Is that true?
And with the, you could have an executive session regarding a specific employee's
Right.
situation. You can't.
It's a risk.
That's the exception. The exception would be for
That's all
a
right.
specific employee.
Let's do that.
I second that.
Yeah.
All right.
We're going to have it about a specific employees? Really?
Yep. If we are taking
Why are
this-
we, I don't,
if
I
we're
mean,
taking
take,
it seriously.
I think that really, I guess for my purposes, and again, you can make your own decisions on what you need to do. What I was asked to talk about was making the policy and procedure more robust. I think that it's very important that we add the language, we prohibit the retaliation, we elaborate on the investigation and reporting procedures, and we do the training.
Yes.
As to doing an analysis, a risk-based analysis on the efficacy of the procedures and policies, that's something for a different day. And it shouldn't be something that we should just discuss at this point. That'd be my suggestion.
That's all right. I mean, we can work our way there.
Yep.
And then we can also have an executive session at the next council meeting to discuss a specific thing that a number of us are wanting more information about that we should not talk about openly.
Right.
Matt? Do people currently sign the workplace harassment policy? Are they given a copy of this, and do they sign that they understand it as is right now, prior to?
That would actually, when we make the changes to the policy, that is something that I would request.
But every staff member.
Everybody.
Not just new staff members.
That's correct.
That's a good idea. That's good.
And a follow-through, and not only that, on a yearly basis, they are also brought back in front. That's
Now,
a,
we're having issues even with OMA training about staff members who aren't even compliant.
Right.
In terms of that. So this is, compliance would be a big issue too.
It's also given out at the beginning when we have orientations here.
Well, I mean, I understand it may be given out, but is there actually a signed piece of paper in that patient's file that says that they've read the policy? I understand it.
Employees.
everybody's a patient.
I'm sorry. I did say patient, didn't I? Sorry.
Let's continue to be, I guess, careful on some of these things that really, the personnel issues are really between the department, the individuals, employees, the department manager, and the city manager more than it is the consul. I really don't think it's the consul's place to manage, to manage how things are being how the employees are being managed. That's not the consul's role, is to instruct or city manager or the department heads on how to manage employees. And so I got to say, we got to tread very carefully on this. When you talk about individuals, and even if you feel that there's some partisan situations happening, that's not, I really don't believe that's the consul's role to take.
You don't think that's our object, or
Our object
that's
is
our
to have-
right to
I think-
ask if this is a signed document?
No, that's correct. I think that's correct, to make sure that we have the right policies in place and that they're signed and those kind of procedures. But this talk about individual names, individual situations, and then trying to instruct either the city manager or department heads on how to handle it, I don't think is where the council should be.
Well, I don't think the council is planning to instruct anyone on how to do it. There are some things that I think all of us want more information on.
And once again, I guess that's okay, and we can, but I still, once again, there's so many different personnel issues throughout the city to sit there and, why does the council need to know information about these things? What difference, I mean, I hate to say what difference it makes. It makes a lot of difference to us. It does to everybody, because it shouldn't be happening. But the same token is that how deep do we always get involved in personnel issues?
I don't think we need to get involved in the personnel issues, but we do need to know from the city manager that the issues have been addressed and the outcomes. I mean, do we have a successful resolution to a problem?
Yes.
It's more about the process than anything.
How he gets that done, or how the department head gets that done, that's
Right.
between the city manager
But
and the
not to
department
instruct
heads.
them on what to do or how to do it.
Correct.
I'm with you on that.
Sure.
I think too, when it's brought to the council members' attention by residents, then I think at that point, the council does deserve some answers.
See, and I disagree that, what the role to me is of a council member is to pass that on and make sure that it gets informed, but not to deal with how it's dealt with. Maybe as long as I'm stumbling here a little bit, and I want to make sure that I don't, to ask the question, did it get resolved or not, yes or no? To even know the results of how becomes in the personnel's record and that sort of thing.
It
And
opens up liability.
That's exactly,
But I think too,
that's
so
exactly.
when you comply with the Open Meetings Act, we can't all get together and discuss something that we all need to have information on. We have to do it in little groups,
But in these kind of things, I don't think we need to know how it happened, what happened, short of, was it resolved, yes or no?
Well, that's only
End of
from
it.
the city
End of it.
manager's perspective.
End of it. That's correct. But I'm just saying is that that's where we need to know is not, well, how was it resolved? I don't think it's saying they were disciplined or this found out or that found out. I don't think it's the right of the council to know, because I think that's in someone's personnel records. I really do. And so it's just to say, ask the city manager or the department head, did it get resolved, yes or no?
well, and I
Right.
guess I would still like to call an executive session so that as an entire council, we can address some issues that have been brought to the council's attention by outside people.
Why does that exception exist in state statute then? If you follow this line of thinking that it's not the council's interest to understand matters related to employee, specific employees, why did our state legislator create this very exception for local governments to be able to go into executive session to discuss?
Most of those are liability issues, lawsuits.
No, but this one specific exception is related to employee discipline, this very subject matter.
So, well, we,
Put it on the agenda. We have to vote on whether we want to go into executive session. It's not like we just automatically do it because it's on the agenda.
Right.
It still requires 4 of us to vote for it. If 4 of us think that it's something that the council should discuss, we'll vote accordingly.
Well, if, we need to know what kind of information you're expecting out of that, or the session would go nowhere.
One of the things, just a couple of things, and Alderman Parker, to address one question that you had.
Sure.
Not all of the forms of government are the same. Some are set up as a strong manager, some are mayoral, they're all different types. So that may have factored into it. I don't know, I haven't read the notes on it, but that is one thing that may have factored into it. The other thing I just want to make sure is that it is a real narrow exception, and not with this council, but in previous councils, we've talked about it, and it needs to be a real specific situation on employee performance. And I'll be happy to send out, I don't think we've briefed this out before, just send out a note to everybody about what parameters we have, because I would not want us to run into an issue of going beyond the parameters of what the AG has said is okay to talk about. And I'm sure we've got that written out already.
Okay.
So.
If you have something from a citizen, I would appreciate knowing about it. I mean, if you have something that someone's come to you, bring me the details, please. And we'll look into it. But if I don't know what it is, if it's just a random, I've gotten complaints, whether it really is anything that I can do about it, or John can do about it, or anyone on our staff can do about it. But if I can get some specifics, then it's something we can look into.
Well, perhaps we can go into executive discussion or session and then
Share those specifics.
have it
Well, I
not
would like
be-
to talk about them ahead of time, too. I don't want to wait for 2 weeks. If there's something that needs to be addressed now, I just as soon address it right away.
But there's no way to do it without violating the Open Meetings Act.
It means
Well, I
individually.
can address something with you if you've received a complaint. I can address something with
Right.
Alderman Parker if he's received a complaint.
I think it's pretty much all of us.
Again, no one's coming to me with these complaints, so I don't,
Maybe we need an executive session on Randy.
Okay, I mean, I'll shoot you an email about what it's about.
okay?
And then, I mean, can we just sort of plan on having an executive session about the matter at the next
We
council
can, but
meeting?
I'd like to know ahead of time what's, I have to
That's your-
prepare something,
that's your
but,
preference, but as the council, we don't have, we can just do it.
right,
We
but,
understand what your preference is, Randy, thank you. Yeah, we understand.
I think in respect, we should not blindside anybody, so.
We're not
That's
blindsiding
fine.
anyone,
Not a
it's just,
blindside.
it's just part of the process.
We'll give them a
All right.
heads up.
We need to move on.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it. Miles, I think you're up next.
And now for something completely different. So I'm trying to remember, I think the last time I presented on this subject, the majority of you were not here for that. Is that correct? I don't believe
Oh, that's correct.
our newer members were present. So, just trying to give you a little background. Previously, we have had some questions about how we want to approach short-term rentals. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what those are, kind of what the situation with them is, and then sort of tell you what staff think is the best way to deal with them going forward. So, what are short-term rentals? A short-term rental is a rental that takes place for a period of fewer than 30 days, right? So if it's more than 30 days, it's more like a traditional, I'm renting an apartment, I'm renting a house. Less than that, it's short-term. That comes out of the International Building Code, by the way. It can be a room, it can be a whole residence, it can be a whole range of different types of dwellings. Oftentimes, when we think about short-term rentals, we are talking about ones which are facilitated by a digital platform or an app. Many of you have probably heard of or used Airbnb, Vrbo, HomeAway. There's a whole bunch of them. And basically, those businesses make a profit by charging a small service fee for the listing of the property, the booking service, all that kind of stuff. It's similar to traditional hotel stays or stays in a kind of more traditional bed and breakfast, but it is different. It usually attracts a very different sort of traveler. It's usually kind of offering a unique experience. If you're staying in, for example, someone's historic home, that's a little bit different than staying in a hotel. And they're often a little more affordable. If you're just renting somebody's room, it's usually going to be cheaper than a hotel room. We have very few of these in Rock Island. I travel a lot using Airbnb, so I have the app on my phone, and I checked just before this meeting. I think currently we have 5 listings in the city. One of them is Rostocks, so it's not actually one they rent out. It's just so bands that are staying there for the night can see where they're staying. So there just aren't that many. When you look at how different communities are trying to regulate these things, you'll find that there are a whole bunch of different approaches. Every community is different. Every community has its own approach. When communities have attempted to ban these platforms, they are almost always taken to court, and they pretty much always lose in court, or even if they have some small success in court, they fail to actually be able to regulate them in practice. It's very hard to track where these are. It's very hard to really force people to comply a lot of the times. Again, the more intense your regulation, the more likely you're to be challenged, and the harder time you're going to have really enforcing it. A lot of cities, in fact, will have regulations in place, or regulations which theoretically would apply to short-term rentals, but really they just ignore short-term rentals. If you look at all of our neighboring cities and what regulations they have on the books, they all, in one respect or another, are theoretically regulating these in some sense, but we called, and they're pretty much ignoring them. They don't really want to address them. They don't see it as an issue. So, we propose keeping it simple, leaning into change. We're in a digital age. These platforms are not going to go away, and we're not going to be able to make Airbnb or Vrbo or HomeAway not be in our community, all right? So, really, this is a zoning issue, and we want to keep it simple. So the proposal is this. We would allow short-term rentals as a permitted use, meaning they wouldn't need any special approvals or whatever, in all residential and all business zones. So then in any other zone, it would be a special use that the council would approve. We would add on a couple of requirements. So in residential areas, there would be at least one on-site parking spot for the short-term rental unit to try and keep people from parking their car on the street and cluttering it up. And we would also require that the operator of that short-term rental be present at the site of the short-term rental while there is an occupant in it. All right. Basically, if you're renting out a room in your house on Airbnb, you need to be in your house while you have that guest there. Okay. So if there's any complaints or issues, you're there and can address it. We would also require that signage, if used, it's not usually used for short-term rentals, we would require that it be no more than 1 square foot in size. That is as restrictive as we really can get without a legal challenge for freedom of speech. So that's why it's that size.
Hold on, Miles. I used an Airbnb in California this summer on a family vacation, and I preferred to have an Airbnb where the person was not there. We just rented out the whole house, and my family was able to enjoy it, and privacy and whatever. Are we going to lose that type of customer for our residents that use Airbnb by requiring them to be on site?
Well, I mean, I suppose by looking at the number that we have and how low it is, it does not strike me as the case that we have a great deal of demand for this. So that would be the first thing I would say. The second thing is that when I look at most of the listings that we have on these different platforms here in Rock Island, most of them appear to be owner-occupied from what the listing shows. So I don't anticipate we would really have all that much of an effect by requiring that.
I do know Alderwoman Swanson has one in her ward that is not owner-occupied.
Do you know who's operating that? You don't need to tell me, you don't need to tattle, but do you have a sense?
Are occupied?
Correct. Luke Van Lanagan told me about it.
Okay, I did not know that. I know that I have one that's owner occupied, and then I know that there's one that's like a duplex.
Yeah. So the reason that we've required that is to try and make sure that when we have neighbor complaints or anything of the kind, that, you know, we're making clear that, you know, the owner and operator of the Airbnb or the Vrbo or the HomeAway is someone who's responsible and can move quickly to address whatever that concern is, more or less at the same time.
Could we accomplish that by requiring that the owner of the property be in Rock Island, or be just like our absentee landlord ordinance that we are working on? Have it equivalent to that? I mean, what's the difference between wanting a short-term renter to be responsiveness, you know, to be at the site and be responsive, but then we allow landlords that rent out their properties full-time to not live there? I mean, what's the difference?
I mean, I suppose I would defer to the council on this. I mean, this is staff's attempt to make sure that we are addressing some of the issues that had come up in the previous conversations that a few of you may not have been privy to since you weren't on the council at that time. So that's where this is coming from. If the council does not feel that that is a requirement that they want to see, then of course we could not include that.
So I have a question. So at the Hauberg Estate, they're thinking of converting the carriage house into an Airbnb, but there's nobody that lives there. So would they not be able to do that because there's no one that lives there? I mean, I think I mean, I've used them, and I don't want the person there. I mean, if I'm renting out the whole house, I'm renting out the whole house. I mean, and I agree, they should be treated just like other rental property where the person needs to be, you know, in Rock Island or able to get there quickly.
So can I just get a show of hands for everyone? Who would be okay if we did something more similar to what Alderman Parker's proposing, where we would just require that the operator be like a resident?
Or close?
Or close.
I agree to that.
And everyone's in agreement with that? Perfect, okay.
Thank you.
Golden, all right. All right, so then what else goes along with this? So we would want the inspections division to issue an operational permit to people who are running a short-term rental. What would this mean? What do we get out of doing that? First, we would like there to be an annual inspection for very basic health and safety requirements. Do they have smoke detectors? Is there a clear way out if there's a fire? Very basic stuff, okay? We would also, as part of that, have a permitting fee instead of having them pay for hotel motel tax. As the finance director can tell you, it would cost us more to administrate the collection of that tax, given the small volume of these that we have, than we would actually get in tax dollars. All right? So it makes more sense to do this approach. All right? It would also be annual, so we would be inspecting these on an annual basis just to make sure that they continue to meet some, very basic health and safety standards.
Does Airbnb require similar health and safety minimums? Do you know?
Not really. I mean, so as I said in my presentation from 4 or 5 months ago, I had a long conversation with a representative of Airbnb, and I mean, they're not lax. I don't want people to feel like they can't trust that most of the time you're going to encounter good actors through these platforms, but they're also not like sending a person there to in person observe whether or not you've cleaned things well enough, or whether there's those sorts of things there. I mean, they don't have a staff person to come do that. So in a sense, really what we would be doing is we would be assuring people who were coming to Rock Island that these were of a certain standard and quality by doing this, which would be to the benefit then of the operators.
We should call Airbnb and try to get some sort of Gold Star certified designation for,
Yeah, I did ask them if we did adopt any policies or an ordinance, if they would be willing to post it on their website. There are a few other cities, including like Rockford and obviously Chicago, which have had their specific policies linked from the Airbnb website. So if people really wanted to know, they could do that. I intend to follow through with that request, should you approve an ordinance about short-term rentals. They may or may not do that, though I can't make them do that.
funnel them our way.
Yeah. So in summary, we have very few of these. They're not really a big issue. We really should allow them in all residential and business areas following a very simple and straightforward permitting and inspection process. And instead of having them pay the hotel motel tax, because it just wouldn't be worth it on our end, we should just charge them a modest annual fee as part of that permitting and inspection process. So, are there any other questions about this?
You want to go back to that last slide? Well, maybe the one before that. Where's the one where you talk about where they're allowed and permitted and?
Right there.
There. So the permitted use in all residential zones. So the way it is now, if you're in one or two resident, single family or duplex, it's a authorized use, right?
No, that's not actually how it is now.
All right.
So right now, the zoning code does not define what a short-term rental is, okay? So the nearest thing to it is a traditional bed and breakfast, which doesn't seem quite the right fit. A traditional bed and breakfast is really only allowed in business districts, okay? So all of these different short-term rentals, which by their very nature are often not in business districts but are in residential districts, are all not in compliance, all right? And so what they would theoretically need to do, and this is what was discussed in the previous presentation, was that they would need to apply for a special use permit, and they would need to come before you to get approval. That seems like much more of an ask than is necessary for us to achieve our aims, right? Public health, safety, and welfare.
So the difference here is that they could just have an Airbnb. They would not have to come and request a special use permit.
And decisions from this council regarding previous providing or not approving of that special use permit would be null and void if we
That's what I
accept it.
believe. That's what we believe. That
Good.
since the policy had changed, then.
Yeah, because now
Right.
they would be of an appropriate zoning, and so therefore they wouldn't need a special use permit.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things that we need to do is define these in code, right? There's a little bit of debate about, how these should be thought of, because most people who are using Airbnb would agree that it is not a traditional bed and breakfast. I travel using Airbnb quite a lot. It is not a traditional bed and breakfast. It's also not a hotel, okay? But, when you start to sit down and try to write out what it is, it can be a little bit difficult. I think we've come up with a pretty good working definition of it that would be included in an ordinance that would come before you in the future. So we can kind of put these into code so that they fit. Right now, they float out there, and we're trying to hobble them into a definition for something they're not quite, which means that we're applying restrictions which don't seem appropriate. That's the issue.
So just out of curiosity, because I don't know, if you were to rent your house, do you need to have a special use permit, or can you just rent your house?
So this is kind of an interesting point that we have had staff discussions about. So like, what happens if you're not really using, say, one of these platforms, and it's like, you're just going to rent your house out for like 2 weeks because you're going to be gone on vacation, and it's like a sensible thing to do, and you're doing it like one time. Is that a short-term rental or not?
Oh,
Well,
no,
for
I
the
just- Well, I was just asking in general. I mean, if somebody owns property and so they want to have it as rental property, do
Oh.
they have to get a special use permit to have it as
No.
rental? Or you can just,
No, because then it's not a short-term rental under the building code, right? It's more
Okay.
than 30 days. So
And
then
that's-
we
and
would,
Then what do you do?
we would apply our regular rental inspection and registration process.
okay, but we wouldn't deny it because of the rental
No,
in
it
a
wouldn't come
residential
before
area.
you. It wouldn't come before the council in that case. I mean, there's thousands of rental properties in the city. They're not all coming before you. They just have to meet the standards that we have set up for rental properties and register it.
I guess, so, playing devil's advocate, why does a short-term rental have to be treated any different?
Because the building code defines it differently.
Oh.
So when it's fewer than 30 days according to the building code, it's suddenly a different category of thing. So one of the things that we're working on as we do a comprehensive update to the zoning code is to make sure that these discrepancies that exist between the International Building Code and the zoning code are resolved so that they work in harmony with each other. This is an example of something where there's not necessarily an explicit conflict, but there's instead an omission in the zoning code, which then leads to some confusion.
What if we simply changed the zoning of traditional bed and breakfasts to being allowed in residential zones? And then defined short-term rentals as bed and breakfasts?
Well, but they're not really traditional bed and breakfasts, right?
I don't know.
I mean, that would
I've
be
never
the,
stayed in a traditional one. I don't really know, like, there's the Victorian Inn right down the street from me.
Right.
But I don't know what they're doing.
They are completely different. So, you stay in a quaint little property that's interesting and artsy, and they cook you either breakfast or dinner, and there's a number of other people staying there also.
And they're on site.
And they're on site. So it is a completely different animal. So if we're going to include this in the code, we do want to make sure it accurately reflects the short-term rentals.
and it's also looking into the future, right? So, I mean, there's a it's very unlikely we would suddenly have more of these, but I mean, in general, nationwide, this is an increasingly common way of traveling and of finding lodgings, right? So we don't want to necessarily try and, again, hobble more into this older term when we're really seeing the emergence of a new type of lodging service.
Let's do this for the short-term rentals, but then while we're at it, could we just change the zoning for B&Bs?
So what you're saying is that you would like to see traditional bed and breakfasts allowed in all residential areas?
Yeah, I don't know why we would allow Airbnbs, but not traditional B&Bs.
So
Right.
it is completely different.
but I mean-
A traditional B&B is, you might have 7 or 8 rooms that you're renting out, as opposed to this, which is a room or a resident. So now, instead of just,
There are Airbnbs that have 4 rooms and 4 separate people can rent out each room. There's both.
there are, not in Rock Island, but you're right, it could happen.
Well, maybe once this takes off in Rock Island and everybody's making a bunch of money off it, they'll change it. I mean, I guess, who cares? Like, allow the Victorian Inn in a residential, it's already in a residential zone,
And it's allowed there, yes.
because it's got a special use permit, right?
At some point in the past,
Yeah,
yeah,
like
sure.
30 years ago, somebody gave it to them, probably.
Well, actually, the Victorian Inn may actually be zoned business because it's right there on 7th. I'd have to look at the map. But we have a, I'm getting the two mixed around. There's actually two that I'm thinking of. One is on 7th Avenue and the other one's in another area. Maybe that one's the Victorian. In any case, I
Talking
mean,
about the one on
I
20th
understand
is-
I understand what you're saying, Alderman Parker. I think that's kind of that's a values decision for the council to make. I mean, if you're asking me just as staff, like, do I anticipate that there are use conflicts in amending the zoning code to be like as you propose? I can imagine some use conflicts. And again, it has to do with what Mr. Tweed is talking about, which is the scale of it, okay? Now, when you are creating these kinds of codes, right, there isn't one size fits all for all communities, right? So when I'm looking at Rock Island and I'm trying to right-size these policy proposals for us, to me, I'm seeing a distinction along the same lines that Mr. Tweed is between these two types of uses. When I think of a bed and breakfast as it will be implemented here in Rock Island, I'm imagining something of a particularly larger scale than what most neighborhoods and most neighbors would care to have. Right? Whereas the Airbnbs or the HomeAways or whatever that we're going to see tend to be, it's one room or it's like one house, right? It's a smaller scale. There's going to be, fewer cars involved when it comes to parking, less of a disruption. So I sympathize with what you're kind of putting forward, but I would say if we're trying to make sure that our policy is the right fit for us, as opposed to more of a generalized right fit for any given community, I think that it would be advisable that we leave the zoning requirements that we have for traditional bed and breakfasts as they are, and then move forward with this proposal, making short-term rentals distinct from that. Does that make sense?
I don't know, what do my fellow colleagues feel? I mean, does the not allowing traditional B&Bs in residential zones, but allowing Airbnbs in residential zones make sense to you?
I think you're going to have less,
Sense
you're
to
going to
me.
have less conflict with the Airbnbs than you would with the bed and breakfast.
Yeah.
Because
think it-
because of the amount of people that would typically stay there, you're going to have more transient traffic.
Perhaps I don't understand what a traditional B&B is.
Go
I
stay
think
with one.
if somebody wants to open a traditional
for a
B&B, then they can ask for a special
Burnt use
permit.
permit.
Yeah, I mean, I should maybe point out, I mean, the point of a special use permit is so that we can go through it and evaluate whether there is, conditions we can put in place which make it workable and reduce those conflicts, right? There is not a huge backlog of people applying to open bed and breakfasts here in Rock Island, I think we've had the same
Not
hand.
yet.
Well, I'd love it if we had more people wanting to stay here, but at this time and looking into the near future, it seems unlikely to staff that we're going to suddenly have a whole lot of those applications. So, in a given set of years, if one person is interested in opening a bed and breakfast in a zone where it would not normally be allowed and they wish to pursue a special use, we can hash out the details of what the conditions of that use would be and try to make sure that we reduce those conflicts that might arise from that. So I think that that's still the most sensible approach, again, for this community.
Very good.
Okay.
Agree. Outstanding. Thank you.
Yes. So just because I like to be very clear, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to change it so that the change you wanted in regards to
Tenant being there,
the the
property owner.
operator being there, we're all okay with that. Was there anything else that people had notes about, or are we pretty much good?
How quick
Perfect.
turnaround?
Oh, I have a draft ready, so we'll move forward with that in the
Councilman.
coming weeks.
We're gonna get ourselves some Airbnbs.
Well, we already have them, it's just about
Legal,
making them.
legal Airbnbs.
Just trying to make them in compliance.
Yep.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, we're going to take a short short little break here at 6:15 in honor and have some cookies and whatever else treats up there for the Citizens of the Year.
I don't.